Hello everyone, and good to be with you today, and it's great to be here at the King Centre again. Really looking forward to more people gathering back in here over the coming months. It's great to have the lovely worship band and others with us, but again, looking forward to some of your faces joining us here as well in coming weeks as well. I want to ask a question to kick us off with, which is what sort of world do you want to live in? Might sound like a bit of a daft question, maybe. You might think, well, it's fairly obvious. We want to live in a kind of world, often when I ask this question to people, they say without suffering, without pain, without sorrow, without COVID. These are the kind of things we might say when we talk about the kind of world we want to live in. And one of the things that comes up quite often, obviously, is poverty. Who wouldn't want to live in a world without people who are suffering through poverty? We're doing a series at the minute called What the Church Is, and it's kind of fill in the blank. The church is, and I don't know what you think about church. I don't know what you'd fill that blank in with. I know that prior to becoming a Christian many years ago, I may have filled it in with something that I wouldn't believe now about church. But one of the things that church is and is meant to be, the church is meant to be good news for the poor. The church is meant to be this great news for those who are trapped in poverty. I don't know how you would define poverty. There's different ways you can define it. One way is this: poverty is when someone's available material resources will not adequately meet their immediate material needs. When someone's available material resources will not adequately meet their immediate material needs. Sometimes we use the words like people who are disempowered, who have lack of choice, who don't have the resources at hand to, whether it's feed a family or clothe or shelter or whatever. Disempowered people. And maybe you know some of these statistics as well, that it's an estimated 700 million survive on less than $1.90 a day, and that's known as extreme poverty. There's different ways of defining poverty. It's not a straightforward issue. It's estimated that there's about 660 million children who are in what's known as multi-dimensional poverty. And that might sound a bit complex, but it just means that it's taking into account, yes, food and shelter and clothing, but more than that as well. Their access to healthcare and education and other things like that. And if you've been watching the news at all this week, then you'll know, like Marcus Rashford, the footballer, who is sort of spearheading a campaign to see children fed in school holidays. And that's because there's around 3 million children in this multi-dimensional poverty in the UK. And so there's great need there, even in our own nation. This isn't just something that is kind of out there somewhere. And every statistic as well represents a personal story. These are not just statistics that are out there and no kind of poverty is out there. These are things that affect people's lives on a very personal level. And maybe your life, maybe what you're going through right now, you feel, yeah, do you know what? I know what it's like to be in poverty. I know what it's like to grow up in poverty. But it's not all kind of bad news. It's been estimated that in the past 20 years, global extreme poverty has been halved. And that's a significant process given the numbers of people that lived in poverty for so many years prior to that. But then we've had COVID, and there was one quote by David Nabarro, who's the special envoy of the World Health Organization. And he said this: "We may well have a doubling of world poverty by next year. We may well have at least a doubling of child malnutrition." What he's saying there is kind of, we may well have an undoing of all the hard work that has been done over the past 20 years because of the effects of COVID on the poorest of the poor across the world. Now, let me just say that when it comes to statistics and processing those and reacting to them, or what do we do and all that kind of thing, it can feel hugely overwhelming. And if you want to explore a book that really helped me, this book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and it's called 10 Reasons Why You're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. And the point of this book really is just, how do you think clearly in how you respond to the different news headlines and in relation to poverty and all the things we might see in the world and war and all these other things? How do we respond well to them? And he's talking about knowing the facts. And so it's a really helpful book to know how to respond, even to headlines and things that I've just read out. He says, be careful of headlines of things and someone who predicts the future, because there's other things to come into play there and we may not know. But factfulness really helped me. But we're not exploring it from that angle this morning. We're really looking at the question of, if we're a Christ follower, if you're a Christian, then what is our response to the poor? And it will be no surprise, really, that our foundation for our response we first find in the person of Jesus Christ, in the pages of the Gospels. So if you've got a Bible, open it up to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, and I'm just going to read one verse from there, and it's this. Well, before I read it, and before you look at it, if you were to think of what would be Jesus' first words out of his mouth when he starts teaching his disciples, I wonder what you'd say they should be, or what you'd think they would be if Jesus' first words. And what we read here in Matthew 5, verse 3, known as the start of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, many Christian and non-Christians have said this is some of the most profoundest teaching ever been given. And the first words out of Jesus' lips are these in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This word blessing, I don't know what you think about it, and it can be used a lot when someone sneezes or whatever, and or it can be I know, again, before I became a Christian, blessing was kind of one of those words I thought was just a very kind of Christian word. I didn't really understand it. And one commentator helpfully says that, because blessing can mean happy, it can mean, but it's richer than that. And what Jesus isn't saying is here, oh, you're really happy if you're poor. You know, you're going to be happy. He's not saying that. And one commentator puts it this way. He says it's Jesus kind of saying blessings on those. God's goodness, God's grace, God's mercy, God's heart, God's compassion is towards those that are in their poverty. And obviously here it says poor in spirit. That poverty is, when it's used in the New Testament, it's not always just a physical deal. And in Revelation chapter 3, verse 17, you've got Jesus who's speaking to the churches there. And to one church, he's saying, hey, you're wealthy, you've got money, you've got material resources. But you know what? You're in poverty. One thing you lack is relationship with me. And he rebukes them for that. And he says, hey, turn to me, call on me again. And so Jesus says that actually all of us are bankrupt before God. All of us are in spiritual poverty before God. We all lack the resources to put right what has gone wrong in our relationship with God, in us turning our back on God, walking away from God. And Jesus comes and does for us what we cannot do. We are all in the red. We're all in debt before God. And we just don't have the resources. We are in utter poverty. And Jesus wonderfully comes with the riches of God's grace and God's mercy and love into our lives and restores us through his death on the cross, taking our sin, his resurrection from the dead. He brings us into this relationship with God, brings us out of poverty and into riches. And if you've got questions about what I've just said, I get it. Do book into Alpha. We'd love to see you on there and talk about these things a little bit more. So go on the website if that's you. But this is our response. We base it in Jesus. And just because it says in Matthew's gospel, poor in spirit here, and it's a broader meaning, it doesn't mean it excludes those who are physically and materially poor. It absolutely includes those. In fact, in Luke's gospel, he doesn't have Jesus saying poor in spirit. It just says blessings on the poor. And this is one of the strongest words that the writers of the Gospels could have used for poverty. So what we learn here is that Jesus, the first words out of his mouth are good news to the poor. That Jesus thinks first of the most vulnerable members of a community. The downtrodden, the voiceless, the downcast, the lost, the last, the least. That's where Jesus' heart turns to. And then at the end of the Sermon on the Mount as well, Matthew 6, verse 2, when Jesus is talking about giving to the poor, he says, he's basically kind of berating those who want to do it in a showy way and those who want to kind of show off with all the money. Oh, look, I'm helping the poor there, and oh, I've done a good deed over there as well. Jesus says, don't do it in that way. But he says, when you give to the poor, just keep it quiet, keep it in secret. You don't have to brag about it. But the point there is Jesus says, when, not if, you give to the poor, as he teaches his disciples. And then what's the first thing Jesus does when he comes down off the mountain after teaching the Sermon on the Mount? Matthew 7:28, it says, when Jesus had finished these words, he came down and a leper came to him. And what does Jesus do with that leper, that outcast, the one who was marginalized, the one who was on the outskirts of society? He heals him. He restores him not just physically, but he restores him socially as well. That's the heart of Jesus. And it's totally in line with the whole Bible, the whole Old Testament. When you read the Old Testament there, you read of God telling the people to protect widows and care for orphans. It talks about interest-free loans to the poor. This is all in the Old Testament. You've got fields. When you had a field, it wasn't to be harvested to the edges. You're meant to leave some of your crops on the edges so those who are in poverty could come and help themselves. God commanded them to be open-hearted and open-handed to those who are poor and those who are needy. And so Jesus comes to reveal God to us, totally in line with the God that was revealed through the Old Testament. And in fact, a lot of God's judgments in the Old Testament upon the people and upon the leaders was really to do with when they were oppressing the poor, when they were abusing the poor, when they were using their power not to lift people up, but putting people down and keeping them in oppression. God is not okay with it. Proverbs 14, verse 31 says, you oppress the poor and you insult God. God's like, don't mess with those in poverty. You mess with them and you mess with me. And then we go to the end of Matthew's gospel and we go to some of the last words that Jesus spoke, the final words. We've seen some of the first ones. Well, here's some of the final words. Matthew 25, verse 40. Context here is another sermon of Jesus. He's talking a lot about judgment and about what will happen in that time. And he talks about those who had fed people and given them water and clothed them. And he says these words, Matthew 25, verse 40. He says, whatever you did for these, those who needed clothing, those who needed water, those who needed food, those who needed shelter, those who needed a visit, he says, whatever you did for these, you did it for me. Now, those words caused me to stop and think. They challenge the socks off me. They make me think, well, hang on, what is Jesus saying here? He's so identifying himself with the poor and those in poverty. He's placing himself, said, hey, you did it for them, you did it for me, that somehow you encounter Christ, even in the face of those who are poor and trapped in poverty. And I'd encourage all of us, if we're a Christ follower, to pause and ponder those words and think about what application do those words have for my life? What application do those words have for your life? Jesus takes the poor personally and how we treat them personally. And so it's like a constant drumbeat. Drum beats are helpful, aren't they? Kev's been playing the drums this morning. It's helpful, helps us kind of go through songs and sing and join in, and it keeps us in time. And the drumbeat of God, the heartbeat of God through the Bible, is care for the poor, love for the poor, care for those on the edges, those who are marginalized. And Jesus then sends the church to do the same as well. When you go right to the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus said, go in all the world, make disciples, commanding them to obey everything that I've commanded you. To dance to the beat, to walk to the beat of the drum of God's heart for the poor. Last week, those who were around last week online, you remember Dan had a preach. He talked about how God's mercy goes in at the top and God's love gets poured into our lives and into the church, through the church, and then out into the world. And that's what God wants for us, for each one of us. He wants to so capture our heart with his incredible love and mercy towards us that it can't help but flow out into the world. James, in this letter James wrote, he talks about how faith without works is dead. And he says that you can say you've got faith in God, but it doesn't result in works. And some of the works he makes clear are those to do with the poor, care for orphans and widows, visiting people, clothing people, things like that. He said, hey, this is evidence of faith being at work in your life, that it will come out in some expression of care for those who are in poverty. And when you read through the book of Acts, you get these spontaneous acts of care of people and when someone's in need. And you also get these kind of organized acts as well, kind of a strategy, organized collections for people who are struggling in famine and organized collections for people that are struggling with food and so on. So you get both through the church. And in Galatians 2:20, the Apostle Paul, he's talking about the other apostles and how they'd spoken to him and how they'd said to him, Paul, remember the poor. While you're starting churches and laying foundations in local churches for them to grow, make sure that the remembrance and serving and loving and helping the poor is foundational in that. And Paul says, absolutely. It's what I want to do. It's exactly what we are doing. Some of you might remember many, many years ago, a chap called Simon Pettit, who was a leader in New Frontiers, and he preached at Brighton Leaders Conference on this passage in Galatians 2:20, remember the poor. And if you Google it, Simon Pettit, remember the poor, you'll come across his preach there. But it was foundational to the New Frontiers family of churches as a movement in this being at the heart of all we do. And therefore, at King's, here in Norwich, it's totally and utterly in our DNA. We want to see this expressed in all sorts of ways in the things that we do as a church. And it's been all sorts of things that we've done here at the King's Centre, whether it's a gymnasium, we've aimed at maybe those who wouldn't want to go to a normal gym or whatever. We've got King's Care run for years, King's Money Advice. We've had the food in school holidays, providing food for people over the summer holidays. We've done numbers of things here. It's always been central. You've got Deb's up at Mile Cross with the teams there and Ailsa with the teams here at City Centre. This is absolutely part of our heart and our DNA. And with COVID, obviously, changes a number of things, but we really felt God speak to us as a church prior to COVID that things might look different in the future a bit. Tony Green brought this prophetic word last year about, I've seen a picture of a Constable painting, which is a kind of nice scenery of Suffolk or something like that. You know what it is when you see it. And then a Picasso, this kind of cubism. It just looks different. Both depict reality. But Tony said God wants to take us from a Constable into a Picasso and change the shape of the things we do. So while things might change as we go forward, yes, through COVID, but as we come out of it as well, this is still going to be very much at the heart of all we do as a church together. And also not just in Norwich as well, but expressed into other nations. And we've got our dear friends, Edward and Frida in Kenya, and we've had the privilege of walking with them and serving them. Jean and I were on a FaceTime with them yesterday. They were just sharing about how tough things are. I mean, they faced famine, they faced floods, they faced locusts recently as well, and now COVID-19 is hit. And often with these things, it hits the poorest of the poor. And we get to stand alongside them, and we give into projects. We've been out there and served alongside and so on. Maybe you've seen the pictures online of the boreholes that we've put some money into recently with other churches. Water is flowing in places where it wasn't before. I think one area, Edward was saying, it might affect around 16,000, 17,000 people for good because of the money that you and we gave together. So we want to be involved in these things. We want to be part of solutions and helping empower the poor with choice, creating sustainable pathways out of poverty. And we want to bring dignity to those who are suffering. And it's important to say also that we use the phrase working with the poor, not working on them. They're not a project. They're people like you and me. And the gospel, it says, as I've said, we're all in poverty. We don't stand above, calling people up to where we are. We stand alongside people, helping one another, empowering people to walk free from poverty, because that's what the gospel is. A number of years ago, Mike Betts, who's been involved with the church here in Norwich, a friend of our church, he said this from 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, where it says, each one decided in their own hearts, talks about giving. And he picked up on that phrase, each one decided. And he said, although this is very much in your DNA already, there will be a stepping up, a lot stronger emphasis, stepping up to another level. Not a specialist thing, but a church-wide thing. We know it's in many people's hearts, the care of the poor, the love of the poor, the helping people walk free from poverty, and it's expressed in so many incredible ways across the church family. And we're believing this, that even more God would grip us with his heart for the poor, and it would turn out into action, helping people move forward. And again, it's possible to feel overwhelmed. It's possible to look at all the problems in the world and feel, well, what can I do? There's a little phrase that's helped me recently that I've just been living with, which is, I can't do everything for everyone, but I can do something for someone. And for that someone, that something could mean everything. And that's how I'm trying to live. Struggling up and down and learning what that means to live like that, but thinking, I can do something for someone. And Mother Teresa, when she was once asked, all the work you're doing with the poor in Calcutta and so on, isn't it just a drop in the ocean? And maybe you know what she replied. She said, well, the ocean's made up of lots of drops. And she's right. As each one decides in our hearts what we will do, what God speaks into our hearts to do, we'll see great things happen and many people walk free from poverty. I just want to end quoting Terry Virgo. He's written the book that we're kind of shaping this series on. And it's a kind of prayer as well, that maybe each one of us could take into our own hearts and mouths, as it were. And he says this: may God help us to stay sensitive to him in his compassion to the poor, his tenderness towards their vulnerability and their narrow choice range. Let's generously remember the poor, be a people together, and store up the treasure of a good foundation for the future, truly taking hold of that which is life indeed. Amen. I think the band are going to come back up now, and while they're coming back, they're going to lead us in a song before we're going to take communion together in a moment. I just want to recommend a book called A Call to Act, Building a Poverty-Busting Lifestyle by Martin Charlesworth and Natalie Williams. Some of you might know those names. I've got to be honest, I haven't read the whole book yet. I've skimmed it, and I am going to read it, but it comes on superb recommendation, and I just know this will be so helpful to read. And each chapter ends with a series of questions as well, study topics, that kind of thing. It's a very practical book about how we can build the kind of lifestyle that helps people walk free from poverty. So it might be something to read yourself, but also maybe for life groups even. You might think, we'll read that and go through some of those questions. Superb book, I'm saying without reading it fully, A Call to Act, Building a Poverty-Busting Lifestyle. Brilliant. So good to be with you all, and again, long for more in the room together, but for now I'm going to hand over to the band behind me. All yours.